In May of 1945, when the first rays of peace were already breaking through Europe, the territory of the Czech Republic, known as the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, was still under the rule of the Third Reich. This puppet regime played a critical role in Germany's war effort. Every third German tank, every fourth truck, and every second machine gun for the German armed forces was produced here. Throughout the war, resistance from the Czechs and Slovaks was surprisingly minimal, and it intensified only when Soviet and American troops came close to the Czech borders. On the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of May 1945, with the approach of American forces from the west and Soviet forces from the east to Prague, the first demonstrations against the occupiers took place in a number of small towns located in its vicinity. On May 5, the uprising swept through Prague itself, which was at that time the capital of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. This movement was led by the Czech National Council, or CNC, formed in April 1945 from representatives of all the main groups of the resistance movement and the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. A day earlier, on the 4th of May 1945, the Czech Protectorate government, headed by President Emil Gaha, completed negotiations on the transfer of power to the CNU under the leadership of Professor Albert Proshak. The NTC was supposed to prepare general elections for the post-war government. The Czech government has issued a decree abolishing the official German language, which has become an important symbol of the revival of national identity. On the night of the 5th of May in Prague, it became known about the capture of Berlin by the Red Army, which gave a powerful impetus to action. In the morning, Richard Beinert, Prime Minister of the government of Emil Gaha, broadcast a statement on Prague radio about the liquidation of the Protectorate and the beginning of a general uprising. He called on Czech troops and police to join the rebels and offered German military units to capitulate. An armed demonstration in Prague was being prepared by several isolated centers of resistance. The main military force was the underground commandant's office Bartoš, subordinate to General Karl Kuttelwasser. Her detachments were formed from officers of the former Czechoslovak army, as well as Czech employees of the Protectorate's paramilitary structures, the gendarmerie, the city police, and firefighters. The German garrison of Prague, commanded by General Rudolf Tucson, numbered about 10,000 soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. Met 262 jet fighters were based at Ruzin airfield, demonstrating the seriousness of the German forces. Panzer and motorized SS units totaling 5,000 or 6,000 men were stationed around Prague. The rebels, numbering about 30,000 people, seized the Central Telegraph Office, the Post Office, the electric power plant, bridges over the Vltava River, railway stations with trains stationed there, including German armored trains, a number of large enterprises, and the German Air Defense Headquarters. The rebels were able to disarm several small German formations. The Czech National Council began negotiations with the imperial governor, Karl Hermann Frank, and the commandant of the city, General Rudolf Tucson. At the same time, the council did not insist on the immediate surrender of German troops in the vicinity of Prague, which was a controversial point. The rebels have built up to 2,000 barricades in the city. The commander of the German Army Group Center, Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, who expected to retreat to the west through the Prague transport hub and surrender to the Americans, ordered the suppression of the uprising. SS tank units outside of Prague were also moved into the city. On May 6th, the Third American Army under the command of General George Smith Patton stopped at the Pilsen-Český Budějovice-Carlsbad line, 70-80 kilometers from Prague, having received orders not to go deep into Czechoslovakia in accordance with the decisions of the Yalta Conference.
The troops of the First Ukrainian Front of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, under the command of Marshal of the Soviet Union Ivan Konev, were located even further west, northwest of Dresden, 130 to 150 kilometers from Prague. On the evening of the 5th to the 6th of May, Obergruppenführer Friedrich von Puckler-Berghaus sent a request for reinforcements. A part of the SS division Das Reich was called up from northern Bohemia. A combat group of 60 tanks and armored vehicles was deployed from Milovice, 32 kilometers east of Prague, and the SS Wallenstein division was mobilized in Benešov, 35 kilometers southeast of the Czech capital. In the first half of the night, everything was relatively calm. Then, at 3 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of May, Stika and his colleagues heard the guttural sound of roaring engines coming from the south of the city in the night air. It was a column of tanks. The first SS armored units were moving towards Prague. General Puckler-Berghaus gave the following order. Our attack will begin at dawn. Swastikas will be placed on houses as visual markings for the Luftwaffe. We will use incendiary bombs. This nest of snakes will be destroyed. At 8:50 a.m. on May 6th, the Czech Military Council issued an urgent order to build new barricades, completely blocking access to the center of Prague. Support for the uprising grew, and fresh combat groups were ordered to go underground and protect the sewer and tunnel system leading to the Old Town Town Hall Square from German incursions. Ammunition arrived, and crates of Faust cartridges were distributed among the rebels. But SS units were already approaching the city. An improvised hospital was set up in the basement of the Old Town Hall. It had a small surgical ward and 16 mattresses, and within a few hours, more than 120 seriously wounded Czech soldiers were brought there. By the end of the same morning, the SS forces had gathered enough to launch a major offensive against the rebels. The shooting resumed around 10:30 in the morning. The Czechs had no anti-tank weapons, and despite stubborn resistance, they were forced to retreat. We vowed to stand up and keep Prague free, Stika said. Our troops have shown incredible determination. But on the same day, groups of German tanks broke through many of the external barricades. By evening, the rebels had been pushed back to a series of makeshift fortifications in the center of Prague. Flames rose from the buildings and streets they had left behind. It was no longer possible to hold our positions, said Karak Bogumil. The barricade that we held at noon had to be abandoned a few hours later after 3 German tanks were behind it. By evening, we were at the last line of defense. That evening, it became clear that there would be no help from the Americans. General Omar Bradley felt that Patton might be ignoring the new stop line. He called him, and without mincing words finished, "Can you hear me, George? Damn it, stop!" Patton was firmly ordered to withdraw his advanced reconnaissance units and stay put. "We will probably never get a chance to do something like this again," he told his staff regretfully. His soldiers felt the same sense of disappointment. We already controlled the Moldava River Bridge southwest of Prague, and we expected to break into the city at any moment. And then, in the early evening, we were ordered to return to Pilsen. It was an incredible disappointment.
However, General Eisenhower's caution, previously misjudged, was now fully justified. Early on the morning of May 5th, Karl Frank, Reich's protector of Bohemia and Moravia, returned to Prague after consulting with Admiral Donitz in Flensburg. Donitz and Frank saw this as an opportunity to increase tensions within the Grand Alliance. That morning, Frank contacted Donitz by radio, and the contents of his message, decoded by the ultrasystem, were transmitted to the Supreme Allied Commander. "I believe that Czechoslovakia is the place where we can provoke disagreements between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, even more serious than in Poland." At the end of April, Karl Frank threatened to drown any uprising in a sea of blood. Frank, who came to power after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, showed the brutality and ruthlessness necessary to brutally intimidate the Czech people, wiping out the village of Lidice, killing many residents, sending the rest to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, and burning the village itself to the ground for its alleged connection with the killers. But now Frank understood where the wind was blowing. On the morning of May 5th, he secured Donitz's approval for a bold and unexpected political maneuver. Frank proposed to dissolve the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, transfer power to the collaborationist Czech government in Prague, and invite General Patton's Third Army to the city. At 11 o'clock, Frank presented this plan to the Czech delegation headed by Interior Minister Richard Bienert at a meeting at the Černinsky Palace. The uprising stopped these actions, and the rebels arrested Bienert, who immediately took the oath of allegiance to the exiled Czechoslovak government of President Edward Benes. At 21 o'clock, negotiations between Frank and the Czech National Committee resumed through the mediation of the International Red Cross. They ended in vain. However, the next morning, Frank, on his behalf, sent a message to the U.S. Third Army stating that he would not resist if it entered the city. And at 14 hours and 40 minutes, Admiral Donitz and Field Marshal Keitel issued an order according to which any American offensive on Prague should not meet resistance from the Wehrmacht troops. General Eisenhower was sitting on a powder keg. If he had marched on the Czech capital, he would not just have violated the demarcation line agreement. The Soviet Union might have had the impression that it had entered into an illegal agreement with the Germans, and that would jeopardize the very future of the Grand Alliance. He couldn't take that risk. The terrible consequence was that Prague seemed to be left to its fate. But in this desperate situation for the Czech rebels, help came from the most unexpected side, from the Russian Liberation Army of General Andrei Vlasov. After several days of secret negotiations with members of the Czech underground, the 1st Division of this army, a well-equipped unit of more than 15,000 people, was ready to turn against its German masters and support the rebels in Prague. It was located less than 32 kilometers from the Czech capital. Vlasov's men could link up with the Czech rebels in a matter of hours.
On November 14, 1944, Prague Castle was chosen as the starting point of the campaign of the army of General Andrei Vlasov. Himmler sent an encouraging letter but refused to attend. Hitler behaved as if he had no idea at all about the upcoming event. However, most of the prominent civilian and military figures of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia attended it. General Vlasov delivered a speech at the meeting outlining the patriotic manifesto of his new army dedicated to overthrowing Bolshevism. It was decided that this anti-communist force would have to undergo serious military training and then fight on the side of the Wehrmacht. Ironically, the forces so solemnly created in Prague to strengthen the Wehrmacht fought the Germans for the Czech capital 6 months later. The veterans of the Russian Liberation Army remembered with excitement and pride the birth of their army. Nevertheless, General Vlasov surrendered to the Germans in June 1942. It took his masters more than 2 years to respond to his call to create an anti-Bolshevik army, and they did it only now, when the war was hopelessly going against them out of extreme necessity. The Wehrmacht did not trust the creation of the Russian Liberation Army too much and reluctantly allowed its creation. Vlasov now had to recruit his fighters from among Russian prisoners of war or slaves held on German soil. Some of them were motivated by sincere patriotism and hatred of communism. Others joined the army simply to improve their poor living conditions. And the atrocities of the Germans against the Russian people have now become well known. However, 2 divisions were quickly formed. The first was formed on February 10, 1945, when it was reviewed by General Vlasov and its commander, General Sergei Bunyachenko, in Munzingen, Germany. By April, she had taken up combat positions against Soviet troops on the Oder front. Now she had to fight against her compatriots. The Vlasovites' business quickly went awry, and the second half of April, Bunyachenko withdrew his soldiers from the battle on the Oder and led them further south. In early May, the 1st Division of the Russian Liberation Army was stationed in Beran, 26 kilometers southwest of Prague. She was extremely unhappy with her German ally. The reason for this was the sharp disagreements between General Bunyachenko and the German High Command. The Wehrmacht insisted on an offensive plan, despite Bunyachenko's determined resistance. On April 14, 1945, Vlasov's division was ordered to engage an extremely well-fortified Red Army position near Frankfurt on the Oder. This order, given just 2 days before the start of the Red Army's offensive on Berlin, had political reasons, the desire to demonstrate to the Wehrmacht the reliability of this new formation, pouring his blood in battles with his compatriots. Bunyachenko strongly protested, but to no avail. On one hand, the Germans were concerned about the use of Russian troops as an independent combat formation. On the other hand, the Russians did not want to fight against their compatriots. The planned combat encounter ended in complete failure. The Red Army's defense was held by Major General Liethoff's 119th Tank Brigade. The Liethoff bridgehead on the west bank of the river was heavily fortified. All approaches to it were covered with machine guns and mortars. He was also protected by flooded fields in front of the position, which formed a swamp of about 1.5 kilometers wide, and in places up to 1.8 meters deep. Liethoff had an artillery regiment on the eastern bank of the river, ready to support the defenders with fire. Sigismund Dikbalis, a soldier in Bunyachenko's division, described the offensive as follows: "Our troops were hit by a hail of bullets and mine fragments. Some slowly fell into the swamp and drowned. A fierce barrage of fire reduced the number of remaining fighters to a platoon, and 8 machine guns of the reserve detachment of the Red Army, which appeared as if out of nowhere, hacked them to pieces. It was clear that the attack would go no further. After 5 hours of senseless slaughter, General Bunyachenko withdrew his troops and led them away from the German positions. He lost more than 350 men. The Red Army only lost 13. The division moved south."
On May 6th, German troops broke into the city center, capturing the town hall and the bridges over the Vltava River. On May 7th, the 1st Division of the ROA broke into the center of Prague and cut through the German group on the left bank of the Vltava River, and also took Mount Petroshin and the Kuleshkovitsy area, capturing about 10,000 German soldiers. However, fearing a negative reaction from the Soviet command to the military alliance of the rebels with Vlasov, the Czech National Council issued a new appeal. "Soldiers of the so-called Vlasov army, you were organized to fight against your Soviet government. You decided in time to turn your weapon against the Nazis, against the enemies of your homeland. We welcome this decision of yours. Beat the Nazis like the people of Prague, like the glorious Red Army beat them." After that, the CHNS demanded the withdrawal of the 1st Division of the ROA from Prague. On the night of the 7th to the 8th of May, all units of the division abandoned their positions in Prague and retreated westward. On May 8th, Field Marshal General Schreiner, having learned of the capitulation of the Reich, signed in Reims, ordered the German fascist troops to leave Prague and retreat to the American zone. The Czech National Council agreed not to obstruct them. However, about 6,000 SS units remained in Prague, including the 2nd Panzer Division Reich, the 5th Panzer Division Viking, and the 44th Motorized Division Wallenstein, which was at the stage of formation, which continued fighting. On the morning of May 8th, American parliamentarians arrived at Schreiner's headquarters and announced that their army would not liberate Prague. They also met with Vlasov's representatives, who received the same message. Bunyachenko ordered his men to move west immediately. The Germans who had been fighting the Vlasovites a few hours earlier also ran there. Schreiner gave the CHNS an ultimatum, to let his troops out of the city without a fight. The request was accepted. The corresponding agreement was signed by Kutlevash and the German commandant of Prague, General Toussaint, at 16 o'clock on the 8th of May. The Soviet command planned to launch the Prague offensive on May 7th with the forces of the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Ukrainian fronts in order to encircle the troops of Army Group Center east of Prague. However, the situation in the city forced Marshal Konev to act a day earlier. The 4th Tank Army under the command of Colonel General Dmitry Leyushenko and the 3rd Tank Army under the command of Colonel General Pavel Rybalko were forced to march on Prague. On the night of the 9th of May, the tank armies of the 1st Ukrainian Front made an 80-kilometer march. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the 10th Guards Tank Corps of the 4th Guards Tank Army was the first to enter Prague. The 9th Mechanized Corps of the 3rd Guards Tank Army followed him to the city. Soon the tankers were supported by the advanced units of the 13th and 3rd Guards armies. By 10 a.m., Soviet troops, with the active support of the population, had completely cleared the capital of Czechoslovakia of the invaders.
By 18 p.m., the mobile formations of the 4th Ukrainian Front entered it, having covered 200 kilometers during the day. The first to enter the city was the head patrol of the 63rd Guards Chelyabinsk Tank Brigade of the 1st Ukrainian Front, consisting of 3 tanks under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Leonid Barakov. Marshal Konev became an honorary citizen of Prague. A street was named after the tank commander, Lieutenant Ivan Goncharenko, who died from the explosion of a Faust cartridge in the area of the Menesov Bridge. During the uprising in Prague from the 5th to the 9th of May, more than 1,500 Czech rebels, about 1,000 German soldiers, and 300 Vlasov soldiers died. The losses of Soviet troops in the battles for Prague and the surrounding area amounted to about 500 soldiers and officers. There were significant civilian casualties. The total losses of the Soviet army during the Prague operation amounted to 11,997 killed and 40,501 wounded, as well as 373 tanks, 1,006 guns, and 80 aircraft. About 500 soldiers and officers who were buried at the Olshansky Cemetery fell in the city itself.
On the morning of May 9th, the German retreat turned into a disorderly flight. About 860,000 soldiers and officers of the Schörner Group were captured by the Soviets as the Americans closed the front in front of them. On May 9th, Schörner left the army, boarded a plane, and landed in American-controlled territory. But after interrogation, he was extradited to the USSR. A special meeting at the Ministry of State Security sentenced him to 25 years in the camps. In January 1955, Schörner was released to Germany, where he served time for brutality against German soldiers and died in 1973, the last of Hitler's field marshals. On the evening of May 9th, the remnants of the elite SS divisions Reich and Wallenstein, under the command of Obergruppenführer Friedrich von Puckler-Burghaus, approached the dividing line between Soviet and American troops near the village of Slivitz. After the Americans refused to accept their surrender, the SS dug in. On May 12th, the last battle of World War II in Europe took place there, in which the attacking Soviet units were supported by American artillery. About 1,000 SS men were killed, over 6,000 surrendered, and Puckler-Burghaus shot himself. 187 wounded Vlasov soldiers left in Prague hospitals were immediately killed. In total, according to the German historian Joseph Hupman, the victors shot about 600 ROA soldiers in Prague and its surroundings without trial within a few days. Vlasov was arrested by the Smersh authorities on May 12th, and his chief of staff, General Trukhin, was arrested on May 15th. Generals Jilenkov, Malchkin, Bunyanchenko, and Maltsev reached the Americans but were handed over to the USSR and hanged in the courtyard of Butyrskaya prison on August 1, 1946, along with Vlasov and Trukhin. At first, it was planned to hold a public trial over them in the House of Unions, but on April 26, 1946, Minister of State Security Viktor Abukamov and Chairman of the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court, Vasily Ulrich, appealed to Stalin with a request to hear the traitors' case in a closed court session in connection with the possibility of the defendants presenting anti-Soviet views in an open trial, which objectively may coincide with the sentiments of a certain part of the population. In 1949, the communist authorities of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic declared the leaders of the National Council traitors. The commander of the uprising, Jaromír Nakanský, was shot. The deputy chairman of the council, prominent communist Josef Smrkovsky, and General Kutlwasser received long prison sentences and were released only in 1960. For some time, Kutlwasser was held in the same camp as General Toussaint and later lived out his life working as a watchman at a beer factory. In the new Czech Republic, he was posthumously awarded the rank of Army General. Smrkovsky was reinstated in the party, and he became a prominent figure in the Prague Spring of 1968. The chairman of the council, 69-year-old Professor Albert Prazak, was not touched, but was deprived of the opportunity to engage in science and social activities. The retreat of the Wehrmacht was accompanied by spontaneous Czech massacres of unarmed Sudeten Germans. About 200,000 civilians fled to Germany and Austria. The rest was soon evicted in an organized manner to the American and British occupation zones on the instructions of President Beneš.
To commemorate the victory, The Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR established the Medal for the Liberation of Prague, which was awarded to over 390,000 people, including more than 40,000 Czech citizens. These Soviet soldiers sacrificed their lives and health on the altar of the great victory after Berlin, the main fascist lair, was taken and Germany was defeated. The Second World War in Europe ended not in Berlin but in Prague, which became the last capital on the continent to be liberated from Nazi occupation. The final point was reached after the signing of the Act of Unconditional Surrender of the German armed forces. Big politics intervened in the military operations, and there is still a debate about who actually liberated Prague and whether liberation should be discussed at all in this case. The three competing forces were striving for one thing: to invite the Americans to Prague. They did not accept the gift, paying Stalin for his participation in the war with Japan. For the umpteenth time in history, our soldiers rushed to the aid of the Slavic brothers. Without knowing the details of what was happening in Prague, they went to rescue the rebellious Czechs from the fascist terror. After defeating Hitler, they rejoiced that they had survived the terrible war, but they did not doubt for a second that there was no one else to help the people of Prague. Ivan Konev ordered not to use heavy artillery and bomber aircraft during the storming of the historical center of Prague. The grateful descendants of those Czechs whom he went to save and whose capital he so protected from destruction recently demolished the monument to this great Russian commander. I feel sorry for them, because the wretchedness of the soul can only cause pity, a pejorative pity that is nothing but contempt.